Okay, so this is the title of the presentation, which I'm just thinking I probably should have called Archipelagic Imaginaries of World-Centered Art Education at the End of the Day. Sorry, when I get nervous I tell bad jokes. It's a kind of cultural Tourette's syndrome. I want to begin the presentation though by acknowledging the immense work that has been done by island studies scholars all over the world in the last 20 to 25 years. Many of the central concepts in this conference, such as archipelagic thinking, have gained a contemporary currency due to the rigorous work of key academics such as Geoffrey Baldacchino, Grant McCall, Christian Duprattier, Elizabeth de Loughran, Carol Fabogoto, Kathy Jetnell-Kitchener, Jonathan Pugh, and many, many others. While island studies has emerged as a respected academic discourse in the last number of years, it is still, nevertheless, a relatively marginal discourse in academia. And yet, if island studies is marginal, then the study of the archipelago, and more specifically the study of the urban archipelago, is even more marginalized. For example, in 2011, a group of prominent island studies scholars in the Irish Studies Journal called for the development of a archipelagic studies, stating that, quote, what remains largely absent or silent are ways of being, knowing, and doing, ontologies, epistemologies, and methods that illuminate island spaces as interrelated, mutually constituted, and co-constructed. Equally, the first journal of urban island studies only emerged in 2015 with the explicit purpose of exploring, quote, island and urban processes around the world, taking an island approach to urban research and an urban approach to island research. So I just want to flag that a little bit and maybe sound a note of caution in terms of theoretical discourses taking up island studies and being aware of the particular kind of histories that have led us to where we are. My own engagement with these discourses began about 5 years ago as a result of my current teaching position as a coordinator of a visual arts course on an island off the west coast of Ireland called Sherkin Island. When I took over this course, it was operating in quite a traditional manner as an artist's retreat or residency program, a place for artists to study and develop individual practices away from the urban masses and the chaos of the city. In many respects, the course was modeled on an infamous course in St. Ives, the St. Ives Painting School, which preferenced nostalgic abstract representations of idyllic landscapes, divorced from any critical or imminent engagement with the island. This particular romantic notion of the island as a retreat tended to affirm some problematic stereotypes about artistic practice and artistic education as the training ground for radically isolated, self-interested artists in preparation for a conservative art world. But it also, more problematically, affirmed the reproduction of stereotypes of the island itself as an isolated entity, as a place to escape from the world rather than a place to be in dialogue with the world. So, in an attempt to decouple the course from the these romantic associations, I set out to develop what's called a nisological approach to artistic education. Originally coined by A.A. Moles and later popularized in the 1990s by Christian Duprattier, the concept of nisology can be understood as the study of islands in their own terms. It is a concept that developed in response to the often reductive and phobic perspective of islands as insular and backward. Contrary to the continental view of island culture, nisological approaches to island knowledge focus on the complexity of islanders' relationship to the environment, migration, and flow. So from this context, the concept of archipelagic thinking began to take on a more operative role as a spatial metaphor and a curricular model in the course for connecting other archipelagic communities through artistic research and innovative pedagogies. Emerging out of island studies, archipelagic thinking was originally developed by Martinique poet and philosopher Edouard Glissant. For Glissant, islands are often perceived externally as isolated entities or, quote, small dots of land in a big blue ocean. But in fact, islands occupy a large section of the Earth's surface far in excess of their landmass. Emphasizing the Pacific Islands in particular, Professor Epil Halouf writes, quote, "There is a world of difference between viewing the Pacific as islands in a far sea and as a sea of islands. The first emphasizes dry surfaces in a vast ocean far from the centers of power, which stresses the smallest and remotest of islands. The second is a more holistic perspective in which things are seen in the totality of their relationships. Bound by the sea, this relational dimension creates a dialogue between island localities that are generative and imaginative rather than isolationist and insular. It is within this context that Paul Hayward has suggested the term Archipelago to give greater critical prominence to the sea as a living space with islands rather than a navigational space between islands. This proposition has taken on a greater significance in recent years through the discourses of the Anthropocene, which have repoliticized the sea." Next slide. Oh, sorry, go back one. My fault. So, these particular kinds of themes are explored on the course through the concept of archipelagraphy, which was proposed by Elizabeth de Loughran in 2001, and which can be understood as the theoretical framework for thinking the historical relation between continents and islands, a shifting history between colonial power, economic expansion, and environmental change. Combining historical discourses on archipelagic thinking through the environmental arts and social practice, the course has fostered knowledge exchanges across local and international island communities through unique methodological approaches. For example, in 2017, partly in response to the unfolding crisis in the British Isles through the Brexit negotiations, a large-scale archipelagic art education programme was developed on the course, which culminated in an event called What is an Island? So I'm going to just show a short 5-minute film on this, but the aim of the project was to develop a 14-hour boat trip between islands where the islands housed exhibitions responding to the Brexit crisis, but the boat itself was used as a pedagogical platform in which different lecturers and diplomats were invited to give a talk. So in this way, it articulates some of this very material relationship between land, sea, land, sea, land, sea, that we understand as archipelagic thinking. So if it's okay to just play 5 minutes of this. I think it was set up. Here we go.
What is a boat? If you look up the dictionary, a small vessel for travelling over water propelled by oars, sails or an engine. A boat is a watercraft of a large range of type and size. Ships are generally distinguished from boats based on their larger size. So one answer, a ship can carry a boat, but a boat can't carry a ship. Another answer, if you talk to the captain of a boat, he gets quite annoyed if you refer to his vessel as a boat, but a boat's captain is going to be quite pleased when you refer to his vessel as a ship.
It's based a lot on navigation, a system that the men would have used here on the island and around the surrounding area, where they would get bearings for navigation to clear rocks or to find a fishing ground. They would use these bearings. So, for example, if you wanted to get a bearing, I'll give you kind of a small visual idea. If over here was Baltimore and here was Sherwood, and you wanted to get to somewhere in the middle, you could see I'll take the hill over here and a house over here, and where the two would meet, where the two lines crosses, would be the area that you'd want to find, or it could be to avoid. The sea is very important as well in this project because we're talking about islands and that remoteness, and maybe sometimes people think that you're isolated, but the sea actually isn't. In one way, I think the sea is what's around us all. It's that common thread that connects a lot of people. Even though you think that you're isolated, it's that same water that we use every day to connect with each other.
Islands, night ferry, dull water, brackish washes, not beaching, but bird to the bare rock. Night ferry, industrious unmooring, factorying over water, scour dry rust day air, bearing out to the rock, bearing quiet, all rockward and seaward, no backward and forward, nor starward, nor sternward, nor even port, now nor north. Just this uncertain ward of uttering, harbouring lumpen intentions, scraped down within the dull which were word. Salt, scratch, dust, bladder, rackage, itch, dry, sharp sea edge, to the owl gap appointed, to an here, an awayness without leaving, night ferrying to night ferry.
Something that deeply concerns me today when it comes to the politics of islands within the Anthropocene and global warming. You read any novel from Homer to Defoe to Robinson Crusoe and so on, and the thing I want to say is that the island is once again being romanticised as a figure of global warming. And in particular, Indigenous islanders are being celebrated for their resilience. Indigenous islanders in the Pacific or the Atlantic or wherever, islanders are resilient. They're tough and strong people, don't get me wrong. But the point I want to make about this is this suits powerful people, because people in powerful nations are going with the idea that these kind of indigenous Maoris or whatever are stronger, resilient and more attuned with the environment, which a lot of people are also celebrating from an anti-colonial perspective. In a weird way, what's happening is that the figure of the Indigenous islander is more attuned to nature, more in tune to the environment, that fits into this whole new era we're talking about, can also be deeply problematic. Because as my friends in the Caribbean say, when they're celebrated as the Indigenous subject, well, that's great then. So you're saying we've got to be resilient and it's over to us to deal with this stuff, when most of the pollution's coming from America or Europe or whatever.
Okay, so I just stopped on that because that's a very specific point that I want to follow up on. As suggested, the Anthropocene has an impact on all social discourses. However, it is often island communities who feel the effects of climate change most tangibly. As Pugh argues, islands are once again becoming sites of experimentation and signification within the Anthropocene, and yet they have potentially contributed very little to the excesses that have influenced the crisis of the Anthropocene that we experience. On the contrary, because islanders live so closely with the climate in their daily lives, they tend to have a deeper understanding and empathy for the diversity of the environment in which they live. Significantly, islanders have a knowledge of their environment and locality that is too often overlooked in the context of climate change, where they are often presented as objects of environmental catastrophe rather than subjects of environmental change. In a seminal work on this problem, titled Wishful Thinking, Carol Fobogoto argues that islands are increasingly being subject to an eco-colonial gaze, which reconfigures islands and archipelagos as laboratories for experimentations with the end-of-the-world scenarios, which she calls islands as canaries in the coal mine. At the centre of this eco-colonial gaze is the normative affirmation of a resilient subjectivity, a subjectivity which has a very particular relationship to educational discourse in the 20th century, which I'm going to explore, beginning with the concept of human capital. I just want to reflect really quickly on this idea of resilient subjectivity. To me, after Bernard's presentation, this is something that is appropriate to this era of entropic economic impact on the Anthropocene. The resilient subject is directly related to this particular issue. Next slide. So I'm going to just chart this educationally and link the resilient subject of the Anthropocene to the resilient educational subject. Initially proposed by Adam Smith in The Wealth of Nations, as an economic response to the dwindling of planetary resources through industrialization, the concept of human capital lay dormant throughout the first half of the 20th century until it was revisited by the Chicago School of Economics, such as Theodore Schultz and Milton Friedman in the 1950s. Expanding on the idea of education being opened up to the possibility of financial speculation, Schultz and Friedman encouraged individuals to see all activities, domestic or otherwise, as forms of investment in their own stock. For economist Gary Becker, such rational choices describe how an individual invests time and money acquiring attributes, knowledges, and competencies that they are more likely to maximize the return on in the marketplace. Next slide. Next slide. This plays out in Ireland in a very specific way over a period of time of about 30 years. I won't get into it too much, but it's what's called the shift from the theocentric paradigm to the mercantile paradigm, from the church to the market. Next slide. One of the main sort of analysis of this particular shift is the book previously viewed, and these are some of the points that come out of this particular analysis, where he argues that the mercantile paradigm has produced this individualization of felt needs and wants, the differentiation of interests and the suspension of one's own interests for those of others, a calculus of benefit and loss in the act of social exchange, a drive to maximize individual benefit to minimize loss, mobility and flexibility in the pursuit of utility. Next slide, please. Okay, in a different context, North American context, Ian Baptiste questions the various ways that individuals are prepared for these environments through educational institutions, and he uses the myth of the lone wolf to explore how a pedagogical program suited to each of these respective positions would be determined by three key attributes. Next slide. These are that the ultimate human capital subject is apolitical, because according to the rules of the market, consensus would be assumed a priori, not sought through political struggle. Number two, that human capital must be adaptive and individualized, where adaptive learning and promote adaptive learning, whereby the subject is, quote, sufficiently flexible in order to stay one step ahead of the fluctuations and instabilities of the market. And three, a pedagogical program adapted toward the advantage of the lone wolf, quote, would be fundamentally about getting each learner to stock up with enough ammunition to face the world as an educational Rambo. Next slide. So for political scientist Julian Reed, adaptability, utility maximization, and market flexibility are what he calls the economic pillars of a neoliberal subjectivity that came to be defined in the late 20th century as the development security nexus. That is, through the investment in human capital stock of skills and attributes, a person can protect themselves against economic insecurity and against generalized precarity. However, highlighting neoliberals' capacity to appropriate its external antagonism, Reid outlines that the emerging concept of resilience did not develop out of classical neoliberal subjectivity, defined here as human capital, but rather out of its alternative, its oppositional discourse, the discourse of sustainable development. He writes, quote, "It is no accident that the concept of resilience derives directly from ecology, referring to the buffer capacities of living systems, their ability to absorb perturbations, or the magnitude of disturbance that can be absorbed before a living system changes its structures by changing the variable processes that control behaviour." In this sense, then, he argues that economic reason is conceived within neoliberalism as a servant of ecological reason. Significantly within this analysis, Reid argues that the resilient subject is increasingly equated with the poor and the vulnerable and environmental disaster. I think the following slide illustrates this perfectly. This is a slide that has taken a poster campaign that was developed after Hurricane Katrina, which simply says, "Stop calling me resilient, because every time you say, oh, they're resilient, that means that you can do something else to me." So essentially the politics of resilience is that you stop asking for structural support or protection or security, and you internalize and embody vulnerability. Next slide. So, as suggested, this new survivalist subject is emerging out of an alignment between economic rationality and ecological rationality in the Anthropocene. And as an educator, I think we have to begin to think about how we respond to this. And more recently, I've begun to look at the work of Geert Baïste, a Belgian educational philosopher, who develops a proposal for a world-centered education. Next slide, please. And go on to the next one. So, for Baïste, the main barrier towards an engagement with the environmental crisis in education lies in the consumer model of education that dominates today. For him, this is enabled by what he calls a language of learning, or what he names learnification. In this new language of learning, the pedagogical relationship is replaced by an is replaced with an economic transaction, and the citizen student is recast as a student consumer to be serviced by a teacher provider. Key to the consumer model of education is an emphasis on student-centered learning and its potential to produce a student consumer who will be satisfied. However, as Baïste argues, education should never be motivated by the needs of a consumer, but rather by pointing students beyond the present and the particular, that is, by pointing them towards the world. So I was thinking about this a little bit in relation to John's presentation today, because Baïste also develops a very strong analysis of how optimization and standardization and efficiency and ideology, a very dominant ideology of efficiency in education, actually squeeze out the essence of education, which is the capacity for interpretation, the capacity for creativity, the capacity for analysis. And so within this context, Baïste quite recently wrote a book on art education, where he argues against the instrumentalization of art education, where it is validated only through economic or mental health developmental logics. Rather, he makes an existential case for art as a way for students to have a dialogue with the world, emphasizing how this dialogue is helpful for students to be in the world in a grown-up way. That is, as Philippe Marieux has suggested, quote, to exist in the world without occupying the center of the world. So in some ways, these distinctions between the infantile and grown-upness are quite a contentious proposition. It could very easily lead us to a moralizing pedagogy where the old talk down to the young. So in this sense, then, it's important to note that for Baïste, the distinction between infantile and grown-upness are not couched in developmental terms, That is, they are not about forming a developmental trajectory through key stages towards a final end or goal. They are rather modes of being, ways of existing. In this sense, then, the infantile mode of being for Baiste can be understood as one which is totally determined and controlled by our desires, by pursuing our desires and fulfilling our desires, whereas a grown-up mode of being would refer to a quality of existing where we are not subjected to our desires, where we are not the object of our desires, and where the key educational question would be whether what I desire is what I should desire, whether it is desirable for my life with others, on a planet with only limited capacity for fulfilling our desires, unquote, excuse me. So, it's within this context that Baiste refers to Guattari Spivak's formulation of the educational process as the, quote, uncoercive rearrangement of desires. And it is in this sense that a world-centered art education is not just about being outward-facing towards the world, but also the exploration and transformation of our desires so that we can become a positive force in the way that we seek to exist in the world in a grown-up way. The key to this kind of grown-up existence and is based on the various ways that we respond to the experience of resistance in the world for Baiste. That is, to the resistance against the fulfillment of our desires. And so he outlines three sort of ways that we do or do not experience resistance. So we have a desire, and that desire is resisted, pushed back on by the world, and as a result of that, we push harder, and sometimes in that context, we can destroy the integrity of the encounter, the integrity of the engagement with the other. In another sense, we can also go in the opposite direction and be so, I suppose, traumatized by the experience of resistance and of blockages that we give up altogether. And in a sense, he calls this the self-destructive mode. So, alternatively, he argues for what he calls a dialogue, which would be the middle ground between world destruction and self-destruction, and is therefore what he calls a very worldly space, in the sense that it is a space where we learn that we are not alone and that we have to negotiate the world in a certain way. So, I'm going to have to jump forward a little bit. Contrary to standard sort of constructivist modes of education where the student is the event, in a world-centered education, the event exists only as a possibility of interruption of the student's sovereignty through their dialogue with the world. Supporting an encounter with the event means supporting an encounter with what Deborah Britzman calls difficult knowledge, which she defines as the unknowable excess. Within this context, we could say that today's academy is conditioned by the difficult knowledge of the Anthropocene, which it effectively manages through box-ticking exercises. Negotiating difficult knowledge is often slow and inefficient, and because of this, it risks exclusion from the optimized curriculum. For these reasons, the educational task must be to provide consistency between the interruption of the event of difficult knowledge and the student's inquiry. Baiste suggests that the task of the event in education is navigated through three interlinked processes. Next slide. Next slide. Keep going. Oh no. Maybe it's not up there. Sorry. Okay. I'll continue on, and I'm going to close up very quickly. I've got about 3 minutes. Is that right? 2. Okay. So, I suppose to think of the event in this way is to link back to Noel's presentation, where the event in education is something like a locality. That is, it is the condition of the possibility of openness towards the development of a negentropic gesture in the Anthropocene. You can just go to the last slide. So, in his macro use of the concept of archipelagic thinking, Glissant argues for a perception of the world beyond dialectical thinking, beyond continental island separation, for a world in relation. In his artistic formulations of this concept, Glissant explored disciplinary transgressions between academic disciplines and art forms through his composition of poem, philosophy, story, poem, philosophy, story. The BAVA, the course that exists on the island, develops a similar composition of micro and macro forms of border transgression between island communities, art forms, and academic research. The formation of multidisciplinary methods in the BAVA addresses issues of access and mobility through sustainable social engagement with island communities, integrating research methods to develop forms of spatial aesthetic research. To think the world as an archipelago is to think difference beyond political and geophysical borders as a fluid historical relationship between land and sea, as suggested by Glissant. As an example of a world-centered pedagogy, the course is an important model of how an urban institution, it's run from Dublin, might act in a responsible way towards a situation that is beyond its immediate self-interest. That is, beyond a consumer model of education that is dominant in the city and in the university, and in that sense, maybe beyond smartness. Providing resources, access, security, and knowledge for a small island is quite exceptional. However, as suggested, there is more to the engagement with the island than economic sustainability, but a kind of social and cultural activity that looks to move the activities on the island beyond the politics of survival and resilience towards a politics of imagination and human flourishing. And there's just the final slide when you're ready. That's what you missed. So this is just a final quote by Julian Reid, and it links this problem of resilience, resilience as a particular kind of mode of subjectivity that is particular to island communities today, but resilience also as a educational term that has taken on a metronomic value. It is endlessly recited in educational policy discourse. What we are encouraged to do as educators is to produce resilient students, resilient subjects, and the question is, for what, really? And his argument is that there is more to education, and I would argue more to art, than surviving and adapting and getting by and bouncing back. Thank you.